So as I was saying, when Rabbi Chaim Solomon spoke at the Chagigat HaSmicha on behalf of all of our students who had received Smicha in 2009, he started with the following line. A man walked into a bar and said, ouch. And then he went on to say that was that encapsulated his experience of learning at the Metifta. What he was saying is that when you hear the words, a man walked into a bar, you think you know what's going on, what he's talking about. And then you hear the next words, and suddenly you realize it doesn't fit, and you have to turn it around and think of something else to make sense of it. So that's his experience of how, of trying to get into rabbinic text and understand it, that you think you understand what's going on until suddenly you've got to turn it the other way. The same thing happens throughout life. It's just part of our the way that our brains are functioned to work is that we're programmed to see things through our experiences and to make assumptions so that we can avoid the dangers that might threaten us and get the things that we need in our life. We develop that. It's part of the way we evolved. And very often, though, the assumptions that we make turn out to lead us in wrong directions. And it may not be as immediate as hearing the words and said, ouch, before we realize that we've been making a wrong assumption or a set of wrong assumptions, and that we need to re-examine our assumptions and move on from there. When it comes to the way that we do Psak Halacha, which has been a topic of much debate on, particularly on the Morashah list, there are a set of assumptions that most of us have had, which go back to Rambam's introduction to the Mishneh Torah, which is the main source packet here that you have. What I did with this is that I broke up the relevant part of the introduction to Mishneh Torah, and under each section I put the assumptions that Rambam is making, which come from those sections underneath. And you'll notice that some of the words or phrases are in bold print. In source 1, which is the Rambam, source 2, which is the Rambam's introduction to Perush HaMishnayot, what the bold print there means is that those are things where we have evidence, good evidence, that's come forward in the last 10 to 20 years that those assumptions are incorrect. So I want to go through these assumptions and point out, highlight what's incorrect. I'm leaving the text for you to read through to get the full context of it. If you need to, it's been gone through before by most of us, probably many times. But the term that Rambam uses to describe the way that the Gemara is put together is chiber. And chiber implies a chibur. He saw it as a written text that's written in a book, and he attributes this to Rav Ashi. Okay? That Rav Ashi put it in a written book. Okay? And this is the written book of the Gemara goes along with the written books of Tosefta, Sifra, Sifrei, and Mechilta, and they comprise a canon of oral Torah, which are the basis of all legal decisions being rendered from halacha. But at least those are the major deoraita ones. Of course, then there's in the next paragraph we get the third assumption, which is that there are also decrees of the Beit Din Gadol over time, minhagot and takanot, that were established by the Beit Din Gadol, decisions of the Beit Din Gadol based on interpretation of Torah through Midot, which those tend to be in the text. All of these are part of the canon of oral Torah, of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Okay. if we go on to the last paragraph on page 1, where the assumptions come out on page 2, right? His assumption is that all halakhic authority after the close of the Gemara is local. No one can enforce, no one in any one locality or region can enforce their view on anyone else. Only that which is written in the Gemara, and he says specifically katuv, the Gemara, that which is written in the Gemara, that is what can be enforced on all Jews throughout the world. Why? Assumption 6, because all of Israel agreed upon them. Now, since he believes that the Gemara was written at the time of Rav Ashi or his son, from then on, he sees absolutely no difference between what he is doing when he looks at a Gemara and what the Geonim were doing when they looked at a Gemara, as he saw it, right? So everything is based on the Gemara, and if I look at a Gemara, this is number 7, and maybe number 7 there.
Number 7?
Yeah. The Geonim basically were doing the same thing that Rambam was doing, the same thing that what we call the Rishonim of France, the Bavli Tosafot. Right? He sees it all, right? We're all called Geonim. We're all Geonim. We're all doing the same thing, is his understanding. Right? And therefore, this was in number 5, if the Geonim interpret a law that's written in the Gemara one way, and I come along later and I think, no, I look at the Gemara and I think they're wrong. They didn't interpret the Gemara right. Then I follow my own judgment and I'm not obligated by what the Geonim decided. Okay?
He just said Beit Din, though.
What's that?
He didn't say the word I, he says a Beit Din.
Right. Okay. So he has a Beit Din in Cairo. He's a posek. He issues rulings. He issues rulings at variance with the Geonim when he thinks the Geonim are wrong, because there's no difference between what he and the Geonim are doing. He makes this more clear in his introduction to Perush HaMishnayot, which is the second source, the bottom of page 2, going on to page 3. He wrote this in Arabic, and one of my the things I always noticed was anything that's translated from Arabic into Hebrew, I always had a lot of trouble understanding it until I learned Arabic. And then I understood why I had so much trouble understanding it, because Hebrew has such a limited vocabulary compared to Arabic, or compared to English for that matter, that the shades of meaning get lost when you translate. So it looks like, you look at the Hebrew and it's, they're using the Hebrew word in a way that, the Hebrew word can mean that, but it's not the way I would normally understand it to mean that, because it's a totally different shade of meaning that's in the Arabic. So when you take that, I came up with this translation for Perush HaMishnayot, and the key phrase here is that, after describing everything that the Geonim did, he says that the halachot which the great master Rabbeinu Yitzhaq Zatzal, meaning Rif Alfasi, produced, rendered all of those works of the Geonim necessary, because the halachot, includes all the psakim and laws which are needed in our time, meaning the time of exile, and he explained in the halachot, all of the mistakes which occurred to those who preceded him in their psakim. Okay, so a few things that we get out of this. One is that the Rambam is a follower of the Rif. You can draw a straight line back to the Rif from Rambam. Rambam's father, Rav Maimon, is the Dayan of Cordoba, who studied in Lucena with Rabbi Yosef ibn Megash, was his Rav. Rabbi Yosef ibn Megash was the Talmid Muvhak of Rabbi Yitzhaq Alfasi in Lucena. The Beit Midrash that the Rif started there most likely was based on all of these assumptions that the Rif that Rambam put into his introduction in Mishneh Torah. The one thing I haven't found explicitly in the Rif is any identification with Rav Ashe, Ravina, Sof Hora'ah. Those words never appear in the Rif. The Rif never attributes anything directly to Rav Ashe in terms of the Gemara, but his understanding of the Gemara as a written text is clear, and that it's right. And the two assumptions that come out from Rambam here are clear in the Rif, right? Well, at least the first one, right? The Rif's halachot is basically a 99.9% correct rendering of Talmudic law for the time of exile, which corrects the mistakes, interpretations, and decisions of Geonic. The Rif has many, many, many long passages in the halachot in which he goes out of his way to pick on certain psakim of the Geonim and show how they're wrong based on the Gemara, based on applying klalim for psak halakha, how simply the Geonim in those cases got it wrong. And Rambam is agreeing that, yeah, Rif system is basically good. You know, he's maybe made 10 places where I've got some questions about it. By the time he actually wrote Mishneh Torah, he wrote the Perush Mishneh when he was 25. It was about 30 years later that he wrote Mishneh Torah. By then he mentions 30 mistakes that the Rif made. And I know that my advisor for my dissertation, Professor Frankus, has found many more places where Rambam seems to be disagreeing with the Rif without saying so, close to 100 or some. But still, you've got 99.9% he's following the Rif, and certainly he's following the basic assumptions of the Rif. And chief among those is the 11th assumption here. Generally, there is one correct legal conclusion to be drawn from the Talmud on any issue. Sometimes you may not be able to, because of doubt, you may not be able to determine just what the correct thing is, in which case, Rif will bring two different opinions and leave them for you to choose. Rambam will say, either kachtati noteh, or there are those who say this, there are those who say that. But those are few and far between compared to what Rambam did with Mishneh Torah, which is give one psak straight down the line. Okay. The way I sum this up in my dissertation, which if you wanted to look at, starting on page 177, I look at chapter 7, or if you want, just from the selection that's in the text here. Right. It is clear that Alfasi considered the various sources in the Talmud to have been edited by one editor who deliberately used a number of methods to signal which legal sources were authoritative and which were not. Alfasi's assumption regarding the editor of the Talmud results in Alfasi's attributing greater authority to the logical conclusions of the Stam Talmud, both explicit and implicit, than Geonim before him. For Alfasi, demonstrating that the Stam Talmud expressed or must have presumed a particular position regarding a matter on which there is a Tanaitic or Amoraic dispute is sufficient to decide the matter according to that position, overriding the principles of adjudication which would normally apply to a dispute between those Tanaim or Amoraim. So if it's a case of Rav and Shmuel disagreeing, and it's a case of Dineh, and you'd expect the halakha to be like Shmuel, but there is somewhere in the Gemara, anywhere in the Gemara, where an argument's forwarded, which seems to assume the opinion of Rav, they'll say that the halakha follows Rav. In that case, the Geonim will consistently come down according to the klal that you follow Shmuel in a case of Dineh. But Rif will go according to what the hint, which seems to give an idea of what the opinion of the Stam is. Okay. Just to go back through some of the assumptions here. If you take a look at the second set of handouts, which is from this book, The Geonim of Babylonia and the Shaping of Medieval Jewish Culture by Robert Brody, who is a professor at Hebrew University, where he goes by Yerachmiel Brody. So you look under Yerachmiel Brody for his many articles on the Geonim. He's a student of Professor Shraga Avramson, and he, along with Neil Danzig, whose published works in Hebrew go under Nachman Danzig. He's currently at JTS. He was a student of, I forget who the Geonic specialist is at YU in the graduate school there. That's where Danzig got his PhD. Danzig also.
Danzig with Elman?
No, Elman wasn't there then. Huh?
Honig?
No.
Bernstein?
Huh?
Maybe Bernstein?
Very old. He's very old at this point.
Hold up the book a bit.
Bernstein?
No. Okay. So, pass around the book if you want to look at it. In any case, the book came out in 1998. Neil Danzig wrote a tremendous article in the Bar Ilan Journal in 2006 on the difference between oral Torah and written Torah. What they've discovered is that the Gemara wasn't written. The Gemara, through the Geonic period, up into the 11th century with Rav Hai Gaon in Bavel, was transmitted orally in the Beit Midrash. They didn't have written texts, except maybe, on the side somewhere. The first evidence we have of a written text in the Gemara is from the middle of the 8th century. There's a story of someone who was a candidate to be a Gaon, or was a Gaon, who was deposed, ended up traveling from Bavel to Spain. And in Spain, from memory, he wrote them a Gemara. And that's the first that we know of a written Gemara. The Gemara was transmitted as an oral recitation, and reading through these pages, you get some idea.
I don't know if you've handed that out. Is that over here?
Oh, it didn't get handed out. Okay, here you go. Pass it around.
Jewish classification. No. It's not.
I just did the book. That's nice. I pay that outside.
Okay, so when you think about the implications of not having written Gemara, but it's oral, it takes a while to sink in. When your experience of the text is not looking at it as written, and you don't think of it as a chibur, but it's something that is memorized orally, that's recited orally. And if you want to look ahead to number 6, I've got a selection from my dissertation, which goes into
Number
the
6
different, on page 4 of my source sheet. Source number 6 is a selection from an article I wrote a few years ago, which goes into the different assumptions. Right? When you're dealing with something that is oral, you don't necessarily think of it as a book. When you have a book, a chibur, the chibur implies a mechaber. And the idea that there's one stam, one editor, one consistent editor that Alfasi has comes from the idea that this is a book. And therefore, I can expect consistency throughout the entire Talmud. And if something's argued in one place in a particular way, and something looks different somewhere else, I've got to find some way to make those two things fit together logically because they're coming from the same source. Okay, this is where we get into items 4 and 5 on the list, page 3 and going on to page 7. The Rif wrote in the halachot. If you look in Ketubot, if you pull a Gemara that has Rif in the back and you start looking at Ketubot, around chapters 8 and 9, you'll see there's a line at the bottom of the page, and you go underneath, and you'll see 2 columns of translations of commentaries that Rif wrote in Arabic, which he appended to Masechet Ketubot. on 3 different sugiyot on ketubot. He also did the same thing in Shvuot. There's one sugiyah there that he did the same thing on.
Can I ask you, you said
Yeah.
you learned Arabic, you learned medieval Arabic.
I learned medieval Judeo-Arabic.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. You need to clarify that.
Yeah. Okay.
That came out of what you just said.
Yeah. Okay. So in his one of those Perushim there on Ketubot 94b, there is a case given, very interesting
That's
case.
Dapei Harif or?
This is Dapei Hagemara.
Okay.
Okay. The mother of Rami Bar Chama, who had a brother named Ukba, obviously Bar Chama.
So are you reading from someplace?
I'm looking at number 4 on page 3 of my source sheet.
Thank you.
Hold on. Number 4.
Yeah.
You know where you're going, we
On
don't.
page 3,
Okay,
I think we...
yeah.
It's a
I'm
power
sorry.
there. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, right. So Rami Bar Chama's mother wrote him a contract giving him all of her assets in the morning, and then in the evening she wrote a contract to her son Ukba doing exactly the same thing. Okay? There's a parallel in Bava Batra 151 where it says that Rami Bar Chama's mother in the evening wrote a contract to her son Rami, and in the morning wrote them over to Ukba. So there's a difference there in what's going on. The second part is the same in both versions, that Rami Bar Chama brings his contract to Rav Sheshet, and Ukva Bar Chama brings his contract to Rav Nachman. And each of them established the property as being in each of their places. Okay? In section C, the third part of this, Rav Sheshet and Rav Nachman have a discussion. The discussions go very differently between Ketubot and Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra there. Okay, and I'm not going to get into the details of the discussions, but you take a look at it, they're very different. Okay, so in this Arabic commentary that he wrote there, which you can see, 2 different translations at the bottom of the daf. If you look in the Rif Dapim, on this is, I think it's in the 9th parak of Ketubot, you would find it. It's also Boaz Cohen had a manuscript at JTS of this that he published and translated into Hebrew, which came out in JQR 1927. In any case, his commentary starts with the interpretation he saw in the name of a Gaon. Okay. We don't know who this Gaon is, but he just refers to him as Gaon. And in the halachot, when the Rif refers to Gaon, it's almost always referring to Rav Hai Gaon. So there's reason to think it could very well be Rav Hai Gaon, but not necessarily. We can't exactly pin it down. But in any case, right, if you look through there, what the Gaon says is that, well, we've got a disagreement between the version in Bava Batra and the version in Ketubot. The version in Bava Batra is the more accurate version, and the version in Ketubot was corrupted. Okay? The Rif looks at that, and in the second paragraph here, he says, I've looked very carefully at that responsum, and I have found it to be an inconceivable opinion which is impossible to hold or to state. Right? And what makes it so impossible to state? The third and most important reason that he gives is that the 2 cases are brought by the stam of the Talmud, and it is impossible that the Talmud would bring one specific case regarding 2 specific people and 2 specific judges, and that there would be differences regarding the subjects, the answers, and the times, without bringing down from the Talmud an objection. Right? If there's a dispute, if 2 things are brought which disagree with each other, the Gemara should say, "Well, but wasn't there this thing in didn't we hear in this other place?" And you put them together. If they're not, it must be because they're talking about 2 separate cases, right? So Rami Bar Chama's mother did this 2 different times, and we're getting 2 different reports about 2 different cases. That's what's obvious to Alfasi, because there's one stam of the Gemara, and he's got to be consistent between the two
The
places.
reason for the Bilbul.
Okay, but the Gaon,
Right, based on that
Right.
assumption. that
right,
there's
it's
one
based
stam.
on that assumption. But the Gaon, who deals with an orally transmitted Gemara, right, understands. You've got to,
That it's not-
that this is something that comes from, a long oral tradition. He understands how it's transmitted, and basically he's saying, sometimes in transmission, in the way that the Gemara was put together, some of the details get messed up sometimes, and we just have a tradition in here that we consider whoever was on the committee dealing with Bava Batra when they put together the way that we recited in the yeshiva got it more accurately than the ones who were doing ketubot when they put it together.
Are there instances, or is there any record that, according to the Gaon, which we'll assume is
Yeah.
high Gaon, that there's a tarta de sasra that bothers the Gaon? In
Look-
other words, that could be very, very
Yeah.
plausible to assume that the Gaon, it's an oral
Yeah.
tradition, so there's never any need to challenge differences of opinion.
Okay.
Unless, we have a record of the Gaon also saying, Hayatochen, Tarta de Sasra, etc. So
Look,
I'm just wondering if that's consistent.
I think that there's certainly more research that is needed to pin down exactly. And there are other cases which are documented where, in places where the Rishonim would generally say, "Oh, we've got a contradiction between the stam in this place and the stam in this place."
Right. Otherwise, the exception doesn't make
that the
rule.
Gaonim say, we just follow this one over that one. And we don't try to, we're not trying to justify, to make them work with tarates. We just choose one over the other. Do they do that all the time? Are there some places where, to look in and see whether that's true of the stam? And certainly where you have named Amoraim who say things which appear to contradict each other, it certainly gets called into question. And the Gaonim generally made their psak based on statements of the Amoraim and the klalim that were applied to them. Occasionally, there were some limited ways in which the stam was considered. If it says v'hilchata, which is very late that the v'hilchatas were put in, generally those are followed. Although there's one place where Haigon paskins against a v'hilchata, he just paskins against it.
And that goes again by Hilchas Kavasrai.
Hilchata Kivat Rai works for the Gaonim based on Amoraim only, right? Where Rif went, this is, when I was first, I showed my proposal for my dissertation to Neil Danzig about 20 years ago, and he looked at it. One of the things that he said was, I've never understood how Rif gets this idea that the Bavli is a batra to the Yerushalmi. Bavli, which was in something that in the quote from Rambam he mentioned, that we follow the Bavli of the Yerushalmi because the Bavli was the later authority, right? Neil Danzig, based on his working with the Gaonim, said I can't understand how he gets that because Gaonim only applied batra to the Amoraim themselves, and for some of the Gaonim they only apply it after the third generation of Amoraim. So. It's a different set of assumptions, and where it comes from is that the Gaonim didn't consider the stam to be an authority. It wasn't a separate authority from them. It was a discussion about the authoritative sources. It wasn't the authoritative source. Shma Mina, you tend to follow. Anything that says Shma Mina, would be la halacha. But other than that, it's it sheds light on the way you interpret the sources, but it's not definitive. It's not as definitive as Rif made it.
Whose klal is halakha basroi is not necessarily chronological, but divided in terms of Bavli, even if the Bavli source is earlier than.
For the Gaonim, it was applied to the Amoraim specifically.
Yeah, but even in the Amoraim. In other words, rather than strictly chronological, the category of Bavli over Yerushalmi is halakha. Is that the Rambam's klal?
That came from the Rif. The Rif at the end of Eruvin brought that as a conclusion.
Okay.
right? And it's, right. Where it comes from is that the Rif thought that the Stam was an authority, and that the Stam trumped any Amora.
I see.
The Geonim did not hold by that. They just didn't. I mean, it's a totally different mindset, and it comes from Rif not realizing that that he's dealing with a written book and the Geonim weren't.
Right.
It's the assumptions that you make because you experience.
But the assumption is also that the Stam
if you had to pick the most important quotation of the late 20th century, it's still probably Marshall McLuhan saying the medium is the message, right? And it's the medium through which communication happens influences greatly the way that the conclusions that we draw from it.
So the
right?
Rif's authority on Stam, which is related to Bavli, is all based on the assumption that the Stam is the editor.
Right.
And therefore, everything that was under discussion was a book, was written down.
Right. But the Geonim who saw it who understood it as an oral tradition, that they transmitted it orally, had a different set of assumptions here, and the juxtaposition between the tshuva of the Gaon here and the Rif's response to it really clearly shows just how different those assumptions are and where it leads to. Okay, I mentioned what I wrote in 6 at the bottom of page 4 here, that the respective assumptions about the Stam Talmud and Rav Hai are each inconceivable to the other. Right, I basically spell out what I just said here. Neil Danzig's term is there are two different cultures of learning here, and those different cultures of learning generated these different assumptions, right? Just to point out what we do know about the Geonic academies, and this is in the article that Danzig wrote, is that the oral versions of the Talmud were transmitted by people with 3 different titles: Tanaim, Amoraim, and Garsanim. Okay. Danzig has good evidence from the Geonic literature that the role of the Tanaim in the academies was to memorize and transmit accurately, word for word, the Mishnayot, the Baraitot, the Toseftot, and the Tanaitic Midrashei Halakha. Okay. We don't have any documentation for what the role of the Amoraim was, but from the title, it would seem plausible that role would be that they did the same for the Amoraic statements, that they were preserved word for word. Okay? And they were memorized by a different set of people, so you wouldn't be confusing things. And when you're calling for exact text, you call on one or the other of these memorizers to make sure you've got the right thing. But then you have the Garsanim. These are the ones who transmitted the Talmud, the discussions about these authoritative statements and teachings from the Tanaim and the Amoraim. Okay. One of the things that I was struck by in my research was I kept seeing the words that referred to the discussion of the Gemara as makshinan and mefarkinan. Right? We raise a kasha, mefarkinan, and we answer it. Okay? But it's we, right? The non there is we, right? So, but it's referring to the Stam, and I kept, for years I was scratching my head. Why does it say about the Stam we? And then when I read this in Neil Danzig's article, it suddenly hit me. It's we because we're the ones who are saying it. We recite in the Gemara, when we recite the Gemara, we recite it as a kasha, we recite it as a peruk. There's a different way that we say it, right? It sounds different. You can hear the inflection. You can hear it the way it's inflected, and it has a life that's different. From just reading on a page, where sometimes you don't know. Is that kushia or is it a terus? Is it benichuta or bitzmiha? As Rashi would say.
Are you saying something similar to Greek Sid? That kind of thing?
No. I'm saying, do you read something as a kasha, as a question, or do you read it as a straightforward statement? Right? Do you put a question mark at the end of it, or do you and an exclamation point, or do you just read it straight through as? It makes a difference for the meaning and what it's doing logically in the text. When you recite it orally, you know which way you're doing it. That's part of what's been encoded, and you know what you're doing. You look at it in the text, and it sometimes it's not as clear as you might want. So taking a look at that.
Can you go over that again?
Wait. So you're saying that the oral form is more dense with information?
I'm saying that the oral form
It's
is
more-
more accurate in getting across more information.
Right.
No,
Right.
but more, the reason why I think Seth is asking,
Yeah.
I need to hear that again, is because we're getting a better understanding of that
Yeah.
phrase, that it's not text related, that it's related to how we're supposed to
Right.
punctuate
Right.
the text.
Right.
It's not some detail in the text
Right.
itself, mifarshina, mifrakina.
Right. Right.
That-
It's the what, right, and it's not that there was a text. It's that they had this recitation that they had memorized, and part of the memorization
It's
is
an
like,
oral
when you
cue.
memorize the Torah reading with trope, you memorize, the way it's supposed to be read, with, where the shalshelet goes. At least you know where the shalshelet goes.
So
hopefully,
translate now
when you get there. Huh?
translate now
Yeah.
mifrakina. In other words, it's not related to any specific detail of the text that you're answering.
Right.
It wasn't
It's
1 plus
telling
1
you.
equals 3.
It's
it
telling
was
you
1
how the text is inflected.
Just how
How
do
it's
we read this
inflected
sentence?
whether it's a question or an answer.
That's not-
what comes. Now take
Wait,
a
wait,
look.
oh,
Yeah.
slow down, slow
Now
down.
this will illustrate it. This will illustrate the point. I think it'll help with your question.
One second,
Yeah.
just one second.
You know where you're going.
You're not answering my question. Everybody interpreted and started telling me what I was trying to ask. And that's what I'm trying to ask.
Okay.
You started out, I understand inflection. I mean, we understand this in life.
Yeah.
If you're present and you see something and that is being picked up, then you understand something in any way, just like an actor on a screen. You can say a word in many different ways, and then inflection will matter. But you started out by emphasizing the we of things.
Right.
And then you've moved
Okay.
to the inflection
Right.
of question versus statement.
Right.
I didn't see where you were going.
Okay,
there.
right.
So come back for a moment.
Okay.
How are you differentiating the we part
Okay.
and making the emphasis there? And then if you could repeat that so I can understand.
Good. Okay. So you're clear on the inflection part. It's the we part.
I think, but I think
Right,
I may
okay,
even become
right.
more clear about what you're
so,
trying to say.
The point with we is that the Geonim, as reciters of the Gemara, are part, right? They see themselves as the Gemara. When they talk about the way that what we call the stam, right? That for them was in the first person. They were the stam because that's their recitation. They're identifying with it because this is, we are transmitting this in this particular way. It's a very personal first-person thing, and it's not the way that some text in front of us is doing it. It's the way that we are doing it.
So the point of that,
Yeah.
in its larger sense,
Yeah.
is if you are part of that we process, then there isn't a line of demarcation of authority to which they are subordinate to it. They are part of the flow of that point. Is that what? Is that the
might be a
essential piece?
little bit exaggerated from where I was trying to go. I wouldn't go that far, but what I would say is that the idea that Rif and Rambam have, that the Geonim made mistakes, that what they say sometimes seems to contradict the Gemara, if you're looking at it from the point of view of the Geonim, who really are living, breathing, and reciting this oral tradition, right, it's inconceivable that their conclusions would have been seen as contradicting what they are a part of.
So
right?
let me
What
just
they are-
rephrase it and try to get it
Okay?
the same way. From the point of view of the Rif and the Rambam, they would have seen a line of demarcation and authority there, and therefore the Geonim are the interpreters, which they are part of those interpreters, and therefore they can criticize one another for
Right.
it. Whereas, at least less so, the Geonim, in terms of, let's say, High Gaon in this particular
Yeah.
case, would have seen himself that way. Would that be fair enough to say it?
Repeat that last part about Hagon again.
What is that?
All that line
Yeah.
would have been at least less so.
Yeah, definitely.
Whatever we want to
definitely
say,
right. There's
however
right.
we want to carry it, it's
Right.
at least
Okay.
less.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Fair?
It's the whole perception of the stam is different, right? The stam is the discussion that we're having about the authoritative sources, which are the Tannaitic and the Amoraic traditions, right? This discussion that we're having about them does not have the same level of authority as the Tannaitic and Amoraic material that it's discussing, right? We're discussing it, trying to elucidate the what the Amoraim and the Tanaim meant.
Let me just
That's the point, right? But the Rif and the Rambam, what they do with it, what Rif and the Rambam in his wake do with it, is that the Stam is obviously to them the ultimate authority who is deciding, right? He's actually, the point of the whole writing of the Gemara was to give psak halacha.
In other words,
Right?
you couldn't
And that
say,
therefore you go with the most authoritative layer is the Stam layer.
in other words, you couldn't say it was fixed until it was written down because it was a memory thing, and therefore that could in fact vary.
Okay.
There's
a whole section in here about the extent to which
That's a
things
question,
vary.
it's not a
yeah,
statement.
right. Okay. In Brody's thing here, he's got a whole thing about how variant the wording could be. What was fixed for the Geonim was the logical structure of the discussion, right? The logical structure stays the same, but the wording can vary a little bit within. You know, if you don't get the exact words every time that you go through it, it doesn't matter. It's reproducing the logic of the argument that matters,
And
that
would
gets
you say-
across the point.
So would you say
Yeah.
for the Geonim, while the logic
Yeah.
is clear and
Yeah.
is ultimately more a
Right.
question of authority and
Right.
interpretation rather than a fixed line of authority? Because there is no stop.
Right, right. The line of authority stops with the Amoraim, pretty
With the
much.
Amoraim.
Okay, with relatively limited exceptions where the Stam, like Shmamina or Vihilchata, has more weight than normally, But the idea that the Stam has some sort of opinion about this. Now, the Stam is asking questions and eliciting certain, it's trying to build up an interpretation of those texts, and it's certainly relevant in understanding the interpretation, I shouldn't say text, of those traditions of the Amoraim and the Tanaim. But
That was never the goal.
but it was not meant to be, a consistent between Masechtot
Right.
statement of what the halacha should be.
Can I just-
Okay, now, let me get to this one source that'll put very clearly what I'm trying to say here, and then I'll take more questions. Look at the bottom of page 163 to the top of page 164 in Brody. Yeah. Right. Okay. So he's explaining how until the second half of the 10th century, the Geonim didn't write any Talmudic commentaries.
Let's get this.
You're there, we're getting
Right, it's
there.
okay. This part you don't have to see directly. You can just hear it from me. Right, I'm at the second half of page 163. Right. So he's asking why is it that the Geonim weren't interested in writing written commentaries until then, and basically his answer is that they thought that writing was an inherently inferior pedagogical method. Okay, and he brings this quote from Rav Sar Shalom Gaon in the mid-9th century. He was asked a question from a distant community about what happens when a non-Jew touches Jewish wine. Okay, and he's going through, he's got a question about a text. And he says, if you were before us, it would be possible to explain these things very well and distinguish very well between one another like a word fitly spoken. Pasuk from Mishle. For when a student sits before his master and discusses a matter of law, his master perceives the trend of his thoughts and what he has overlooked and what is clear to him and what stubbornly eludes him and explains to him until his eyes light up. But in writing, how much is possible?
Any Facebook poster said that.
Okay.
Wait, this is something you wrote?
This is a tshuva of Sar Shalom Gaon. Footnote, it's footnoted. You could look it up in, I think
what
it's...
is-
So ironically, he's arguing
what
right
is-
to the inferiority of writing.
Right, so, yeah, but he's the only reason he's writing is he's getting these questions from these far-flung communities who need their guidance, and there's no alternative because they don't have the internet and Skype, you know.
One second. What he's getting at, I mean, I know the humor in this a little bit because people have experienced funny things like this, but is that we recognize something simply called there are different learning styles.
Yeah.
And you can have if you're someone who is better working with written words, you may not even perceive that you may think that people who need the interaction are intellectually inferior. It may not be the case. Some of us rather read, and some of us learn better if we are present in part of the discussion. Some people can read an article by any great whatever, but some want to be at the lecture. They want to see the inflection. They want to be able to. That's how they begin to process it.
Right.
So it's really a conflict in which that's somewhat self-reinforcing. If you're better at one, you think the other one is inferior. It's not so. It's just that there are different learning styles.
Right. Well, it's not just a matter of different learning styles. It's that the way that our perceptions work goes to different parts in the brain and influences us differently. And when you learn something visually, you learn it one way. When you learn something orally, it gets processed and perceived in a different way. And multiple perceptions actually help more than anything else, right?
Practical
When you-
applications in terms of a living halacha, in terms of the text.
Right.
And as opposed to the style and what's interpreted.
Can I just say that there's a book that I just started. I walked into a bookstore in Chicago and someone recommended it. From a New York Times, one of those bestseller books. And it's called Thinking Slow, Thinking Fast. Have any of you heard of this book?
Yeah, I saw it in the airport.
It's a book that says that essentially if you are given some piece of information, there's a way that you process it very fast, right? You see something. But there's another one if they throw this thing in front of you, 27 times 42, and then you have to go, you're knitting your brow to figure out how to do all that multiplying. So I think the thrust of the book, as I understand it, has been a lot of people think we process information more. Some people are getting at this, and erroneously. It's through this logical, rational understanding of things. When rather, that's not really what's going on a primary state, and therefore it actually goes back to something that you were saying. I think it dovetails with the book, is how we begin to think about things is essentially how we begin to process them and how we look at it. There's something even before that.
Yeah.
The only reason I bring it up is I think it's correct that we do different processes, but I think without recognizing the fact that different people learn differently, I think this can become humorous in a sort of a denigrating way. And I think that's something people should be very careful about.
I'm not
I
sure.
just want to come back to our learning for a moment. Okay, I think first of all, different cultures have experienced different kinds of learning in different kinds of ways that are more part of the culture. And I think that what is so important about this fact is not. I turned it into many people have made a post on Facebook because inflection wasn't there and other things aren't there. That was my okay. But I think that was certainly the point of that it is a contemporaneous description of how the Geonim themselves looked at their at text versus it's not. We don't have to engage into multiple channels or anything, but that if this is a sample of what the other Geonim thought and of their methodology that they didn't write, it tells us a lot about their culture and their world.
That's the point I was going to make. We're trying to understand a different culture.
So that's right.
Well, but I appreciate the way Seth kind of set up the dichotomy, not realizing, however subtly, that we've always been influenced one way or the other to kind of choose either or. When you talk about, I think it's, I forget that Maxwell's book, first was Blink, and then someone issued a challenge to Blink, which is trust your intuition with Think, because Blink is silly, so Think is a lot more And then this third book that you mentioned is sort of a Kosovo Shlishi, Shiapriya Beinayim. But we've had this kind of like yin-yang discussion about what is more authoritative in terms of our learning style. But I think it goes back to the fundamental, I mean, there's halacha l'maisa, that's, in other words, what is our ultimate authority, and who do you trust when you ask a shaila? And when you understand something, as I've understood things in terms of shiurim, and I've heard, Rav X, explain, well, based on this is what you should do. And then all of a sudden some guy comes, like, what are you talking about? Look in the tshuva of, based on Igros Moshe, and here's the text, without even thinking about what the issue is. So it's a fundamental kind of divide that I think most of us have struggled with for at least for me, for years.
Right. If you look at the back of the packet, there's, I did this with the presentation at Bob's congregation a little over a year ago. The technology through which oral Torah has been transmitted has changed over the centuries. About every 500 years, there's a major change, and the medium gives different assumptions toward it. Basically, the assumption, Ira, that you're mentioning is the era of the printing press, the Achronim from the 16th until where we are, at least a few years ago, where the dominant way that things go through are printed books. Every book that's printed is an identical copy of one another. We look at that, and those become the authorities, right? So, we assign so much more authority to what's written in a book than, say, people who are working from manuscripts where they know that my manuscript's different from your manuscript, and, there's always a question about what the text is, but that someone can say, it's written, that's because you got a printed text here.
It's written, but now the inflection on the
right, and they don't realize that. They just basically assume that they read it, and the way that they're reading it is the way that the author meant it, which is also in question because everyone reads through a set of cultural lenses that are based on his own previous experience and draws conclusions of what those words mean. And sometimes words change meaning over the time from the time they were first written.
It's not just that. I mean, I was actually just telling Ira. It's not Gemara. I remember a line from Potok that really encapsulates all this. It is cold on the page. It requires a voice.
It's a nice line.
No, don't.
No.
It's and this is the issue. We don't hear. We pick up a book and we don't hear the voices.
Right.
And the voices may be saying those words, but saying something different or slightly different.
Or we hear it in our own voice.
Or we hear it
in our head when you read
in our own voice.
It comes back to sense.
Yeah. But I just want to just on the printing text, take the Art Scroll Siddur. I can't imagine a phenomena that wiped out more local minhagim. Just wiped out the diversity of local minhagim. Unbelievable.
That's an old story.
No, for
I know
better or for
people
worse.
who,
but Siddur have done that for ages. But I don't think anyone sit there ever did it.
For a number of years, I shared an office with a colleague who was doing his PhD in liturgy, and he would spend his time in the rare book room at JTS, looking through old Siddurim. And what he was discovering is, you've got all these local Siddurim from the 14th, 15th, 16th century, and and then after the printing press comes in, it all gets wiped out by these printed texts just dominating. But the manuscripts of various communities were very much more variation.
Much
between
more.
in the minhagim.
Because in this whole thing, what interests me particularly is the very last two entries on the chart, early 21st century. With manuscripts online and response by email, blog, tweet, what do you think the implications of that is?
We're just beginning to find out, but basically the point is, I don't think it's an accident that the research that leads us to question the assumptions of the Rif and the Rambam has come up in the last 10 to 20 years, which are basically the years that the internet has been around, because we're in the midst of a transition in the way that we're communicating and what the dominant technology is becoming,
The message is
and
clear, yeah.
it's already having a tremendous influence, and we don't know where it's going to lead. And frankly, with both the printing press and with the what happened with the Rif is that the 11th century was a time when worldwide there was a big cultural shift, because up until that time, most people considered, like the Gaonim did, oral transmission to be the most accurate way to get something across. Okay, at some point, the first bound books, I think, were a few centuries before, but I guess production of paper and binding and stuff, became more widespread until by the 11th century it was, throughout the Arabic world, well into Europe, and at least up to the point of my pronunciation of French makes my wife laugh. Loire is the river is spelled. Yes. Okay, up until there, by the 11th century, written communication had become, the standard. Right. It's the point. Bach ibn Bakuda was basically a contemporary of the Rif.
So yes.
And if you read his introduction, it's Kovot HaLevavot, right? His introduction starts with, there are all these books about Kovot HaGuf, the obligations that we have to do with our bodies. There's Halachot Gedolot, there's Halachot Psukot, there's, but there are no books about Chovot HaLevavot. And I was wondering, if there are no books about it, maybe it's not as important as I think it is. But I look through Tanakh, I look through Mishnah, Gemara, and I see that these things are there. So there's no book. I better write one. Why I can't figure out why there's not a book about it. But the mindset is everything important is in a book, right? But what was really going on with the Gaonim was, no, it's not everything important in a book. It's we only put down in writing what we have to put down in writing because you guys aren't close enough that we could talk to you. We'd rather talk to you. That's more, that's more accurate. Then I know I'm really communicating accurately. If I have to put it on paper, I don't know how you're going to read it. But we have to because, all these communities in distant places are looking for us for guidance, so let's put together Halachot Psukot, Halachot Gedolot, so judges in this community have something to refer to that at least gets them on the right track. But it's no substitute for coming and learning in the yeshiva with us.
No ish mipi ish.
Right.
So I detect, the scholarship is interesting, and I've heard smatterings of it, but I never had a chance to read what you actually wrote. Which I would suspect that there was a lot more behind what I talked about. But I detect at the end of this somewhat of a bias that I think still troubles me. The thrust is, there's less to rely on the written word and more on the oral side. So let's just take this in a couple of pieces. So just to recap. One, the presumptions that the Rif and the Rambam are making versus the way perhaps that Hai Gaon being part of what he was. Two, when we brought up the modern example and Pinchas mentioned that the art scroll, by having now what's become a significant standardized text for the English-speaking world, at least the traditional Orthodox-speaking English-speaking world, has eviscerated a number of minhagim. The bias is good, at least that it's getting some play. But there is another side to this, and that is a world filled with sort of everybody doing whatever they want, so to speak, without having a structure is also problematic. And it seems to parallel to some extent the arguments. I think they're different, but they parallel the arguments of the development of the codes. Each one is being shried about by somebody, that what's going to happen to the Gemara if we're now relying on this as being the new, not only the new text, but a text in which we're going to be governed by that. And I just think that at least we ought not come away without at least seeing that there's a tension here that is, to me, I would think, irresolvable, and if history is any judge, it's irresolvable. But there is something good in having something being worked out through the text in which we can develop a greater sense of precision and unity and so forth through those written words. Mm-hmm. It's funny, when I was speaking before and I was mentioning that I was really on the other side of things just to give it that play as well. But I just think that that's important that we not lose it.
Right.
Even right. The Rambam and Rif's position, which they probably took believing it so, but even if they didn't believe it so,
right,
you could make the argument that it may have been necessary at different stages that we not find ourselves just a collection of centrifugal minhagim. There's got to be something that begins by, and that is characteristic of the Middle Ages, in which creeds and other things are developed. So, and the last piece, just to put that into perspective, if you don't mind me adding, is that I think you made a statement. I can't remember what it was, but in your last piece, which got me thinking about that, is sort of the bias against the written text. But remember, at some point, the Torah Shebichtav did become the Torah Shebichtav. So it's not as if the written word itself did we already not have that tradition in which we have what to rely on. And the fact that we're so meticulous about preserving it and correcting it and reading it publicly does speak to that part of it. And so that's
okay. Look, just to put it in historical context, Hai Gaon died in 1138. 1038. Hai Gaon died. Rif was born in 1013. Okay, so he's 25 when Hai Gaon died. So his years as a scholar were in the wake of the end of Geonic hegemony, because Hai Gaon didn't leave anyone after him who could hold up. I mean, basically, the system of keeping all these people who memorized the Talmud going cost a lot of money, and the Iraq basically was in economic decline for a century or two, and it really hit the point with Hai Gaon's years that the institution came apart and he couldn't produce it. So Hai Gaon was really the last of the people who were trained in this way, who had memorized Gemara, and that was the way that he inflected it. After that point, everyone was dealing with a written text because no one else would.
Do you think there was an active decision to record it physically as a written document, or do you think it happened by default?
Well, it happened when this Gaon in the 8th century went to Spain and wrote it out for the people of Spain, and transmitting it to communities in the diaspora came through deliberate act of writing out what was otherwise transmitted orally.
Much like the Siddur.
Right.
There's a story.
But that there's no one authoritative to send your questions to anymore who's based on this oral transmission of the Gemara going all the way back to the Talmudic Academy. Surim Pumbedita continued all the way through. Surah died first, a few decades before Hai Gaon died, and that was the end of Pumbedita. Right. The question for Rif is, okay, so how do we get authoritative decisions now? The Rif, most likely, he grew up in a city called Kalat Hamad, which was established in 1007 as a capital city for a new kingdom that arose up from a break-off from the Fatimid Empire. He establishes his capital city in Kalat Hamad. People are coming from all kinds of different places there. Rif was born there to a man who was probably from Fez. That's Ibn Alfasi is the way he's referred to by the earlier Rishonim who seem to be more familiar with him in his history. Or at least the family at some point had been in Fez. But Rif himself probably was never in Fez. He was in Kalat Hamad, and he probably stayed in Kalat Hamad until he was 75 years old when he had to leave town. And went and ended up in Spain and became the Rosh Yeshiva of Lucena. It's in North Africa there that he wrote the Halachot. He's in a town where people are coming from all kinds of different places, and this is something that's happened a number of times in the history of Halakha, which is when you get people coming from different locations who all have their own different local minhagim, what happens when they all have to get together in one new place where they are? You get arguments.
Sure. That's a
You get
mature
arguments, okay?
Jews?
Now, right, how do we, Jews are, you're right, okay? You get arguments because this is how we did it in Fez, this is how we did it in Tilmessen, this is how we did it in, wherever. Okay. How do you decide such things, right? So the Geonim themselves probably faced that because you had people who were farmers throughout Bavel, and throughout the time of the Bavli, it's fairly clear. There's a great book here, Richard Hidary, who is at YU now. Chacham Sassoon is mentioned as a mentor of his. I think he's part of the Syrian community, Richard Hidary. It's disputes for the sake of heaven, legal pluralism in the Talmud, pass it around. Great analysis of Talmud, of Yerushalmi, Tosefta, Bavli, on all of the sugyot that deal with, whether Elu Velu, Divrei Elokim Chaim type of stuff. Okay, and the conclusion that he comes to is, in Eretz Yisrael, where there was one jurisdiction, they had very little tolerance for pluralism. There had to be one way, and they made the decision, and that's where the idea of Klalei Psak was that, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Halakha, Rabbi Yehuda, type of Klalim. A whole list of them in Eruvin, I think it's 46, A or B. In Bavel, they didn't go by the Klalim. In Bavel, you had 6 different jurisdictions, and within any jurisdiction, follow whoever you want. There's a discussion in Yevamot, I think it's Yud Daled. Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, Beit Din could decide. In one place could decide according to Beit Shammai, another one according to Beit Hillel. What's the big deal? But as long as you've got different jurisdictions and you don't have a lot of people moving around, so Rav can have his ruling in his place, Shmuel can have his ruling in his place. It's only when people start, when the Arab conquests happened, Jews very quickly were removed from the land and became city dwellers. So Baghdad, where all the yeshivot ended up fairly soon, was also a place where a large number of Jews ended up. And you've got Jews from different jurisdictions suddenly together. That's when the Geonim started applying these Klalei Psak Halacha and trying to get some standardization. Why? Take a look at source number 7, I believe it is here in the packet, page 6. Right? What's the point of the Beit Din Gadol? Right? It's in Parshat Shoftim. Right? Right? When you get a situation of Divrei Rivot Bisharecha, you got to go up to El HaMakam and you ask the Shofet Asher Yevle Mimahem, and you do Al Pi HaTorah Asher Yarucha. Right? Essentially, right, there isn't one way that halakha could come out. There are a number of other texts on this page, if you go through 8, 9, and 10, that talk about, mainly 9 and 10 here, that there are different possibilities, right? The last one, Midrash Tehillim, right? Every commandment that God gave, there are 49 reasons for something to be pure, 49 reasons for impure, 49 reasons laheter, 49 reasons leisur, right? There are multiple possibilities that are all legitimate within halakha, Elu Velu Divrei Elokim Chaim. But in order to avoid arguments, you need to make a psak. So the Beit Din Gadol is the ultimate way to make the psak. We haven't had a Beit Din Gadol since the early 5th century.
Why do you say 49? My text recalls Shivim. But is there
That's
any...
Shivim Panim LaTorah.
No, but in terms of different interpretations
No, like
as
Mem
well?
Tes Shari, Tumam Mem Tes. Yeah.
This
This is the 49 number.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is a 49.
This
It's
is
probably
simple
one
enough,
short of
okay.
50. There are 50
Exactly.
Sharei,
We always go to the
Bina,
higher
and
number.
Moshe
We know this.
only
Yeah.
got 49 or 48.
Yeah,
49
right.
of them, Rabbi Meir could only figure out 48. So it's 49 is kind of the maximum. If you put all the Sharei, Bina, that's probably where it comes from. That's a guess.
That's like the many rooms in my house.
The many room thing is in is in the Tosefta here,
Yeah,
number 9. I've got
Tosefta,
that.
right, yeah.
The heart of many rooms.
Yeah.
As I think David
Sounds
Hartman
very
wrote.
New Testament.
Yeah.
Sounds very New Testament.
They got it from
Okay.
us.
Now-
So anyway, we're not going to go there.
Okay, but the point is that the Rif was in that situation where decisions needed to be made, He's got a text that he sees written. He's got this understanding that, the Gemara, right, after all the work of the Geonim basically were using conventions to get this, to get Psak Halacha. At some point, certainly by the Rif, it became perceived that this is what the Gemara was for. The Gemara was actually meant to give this, although there's no evidence. All the evidence would seem to be the contrary. The Gemara isn't programmed to give a psak. The Gemara is basically an encyclopedic presentation of the oral Torah.
Right.
And there are ways that you can derive from the oral Torah, and that's based on convention. But the Rif was no. The Gemara, the stam of the Gemara actually is programming a particular way to do it. There's one right answer, and in his time period, specifically in his locality, this worked very well. Here's the answer to who the authority is. The authority is this written text of the Gemara. This is how you got to read it, and you come out with these conclusions. And when he went to Spain, he was able to, over the objections of some of the authorities who were already there, he was able to convince a generation of people, this works. This works, and it's because of historical need. We need an authority who's going to say what the law is so people don't argue over it. And
even if it's at the price of evisceration of local minhag.
Even at the price of evisceration of local minhag.
And
yes.
be careful about that.
Yeah,
That's
right.
Well, there's a difference between the conception of minhag because people are bringing it from other places versus the minhag of the place, in which case it's not necessarily that. It may be, but it may not.
Rif eviscerated minhag hamakom.
Okay.
The first thing that happened is he had a different way of understanding how to make tzitzit than what the authorities in Spain did based on their understanding of Geonic Shuvot. One of the issues that the Rif had was, one of the things he disagreed with the Geonim on was, you look at the Gemaras in Menachot, no, tzitzit's got to be this way.
Wow.
And he forced it. And there's a tshuva that's been published recently in Tshuvot Harashot Min HaGeonim, with Rif and the blowback against that. It was a horrible conflict, but he overrode, and they started making tzitzit the Rif's way, and not the way they had been doing it otherwise. So he did eviscerate local minhag. The positive side on that is that he could point to the Gemara as the authority as opposed to the this Gaon, that Gaon, whatever, and that worked for about a century or more through Spain, and it spread throughout the Mediterranean basin, that basically the Rif became the standard. It changed when you got people from different cultures who are looking at the Gemara, and they don't see the text the same way. Rambam, to think that he could write a Mishneh Torah that's going to be so clear that you don't need any book in between the Torah and the Mishneh Torah to understand the oral tradition, at least the bottom line of what the Gemara wants you to do, right? It's based on what I like to refer to as the Andalusian delusion. Richard Walpole came up with with that line. I don't think he uses it the same way I do, but it's the delusion that if you write the words very clearly and precisely, everyone's going to understand what you mean. But by 100, 200 years later, and throughout, no one understands really clearly what Rambam meant because we don't share his cultural assumptions, we don't share his use of language, we don't share his knowledge of the Gemara or all the sources that he had in addition to the Gemara that he's basing this on, and and so people scratch their heads over a lot of these things that Rambam thought were perfectly clear. He didn't understand that. He was, it's delusional to think that any text has a fixed meaning that everyone can agree on, right? So you get the Bavli Tosafot and the Ravid in Provence and all of the different schools in Provence, and then into Spain. Everyone's got their different ways of looking at it. And what started out as standardization based on the Bavli became, we've got all these different ways that the Rishonim look at the Gemara, and in different places you're following different ways. Now that's fine through the 11th through 16th centuries when Jews are in small local communities and you follow your local Rav, Mara Da'atra. Okay? And if you move from one place to another, so you take now you're under the authority of the other place. That got thrown out the window with Gerush Sfarad. Suddenly you've got all these people from different towns in Spain who had different local psakim that they followed. They're all in the same shuls in Venice or in Istanbul, and they're arguing again. what do we get? We get the Shulchan Aruch that's trying to standardize.
And that
works because it's not only is it written, it's printed from the printing press directly, and you've got the same copy going simultaneously all over the world. And even in Poland, where they're against codification and want to keep open a live debate in the Gemara, right? The Ramah sees no alternative, but this book is out there. We've got to do something. So he just basically defends local minhagim by throwing his little notes into the Shulchan Aruch.
He preserved Ikad Amrei, so his service that he preserved the Ikad Amrei.
Right. But in doing so, he made the code, right? He made the code the standard. Right, and then you get the bifurcation ultimately between Torah Lishma, which is learning Gemara in yeshiva, and it's no longer what the Rishonim were saying, which the main point is La Soke Shmata Aliba de Hilchata, that we're trying to understand the Gemara as what's the halakhic conclusion from it. The halakhic conclusion is follow the convention of the Shulchan Aruch and the Nosei Kelim. But ultimately, it goes down to a convention of what we follow. And Torah, Talmud is Torah Lishma. That we learned.
You were talking about the Sidurim destroying local minhagim, and then we had the Ramah's gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, which tried to impose minhagei Krakow on the whole of
okay, now to be fair, the introduction to the Ramah says he's not trying to impose his will on anyone. You're free to disagree with me. But the fact that it was in a printed text that everyone had the same thing, that did it. Now, they were at the beginning of the age of the printing press. Did Ramah understand that would be the effect? No. Did the Rif understand that the effect of his saying that the Talmud is the authority is that you're going to have different interpretations of the Talmud taking over the course of the next few hundred years taking place? No, I don't think he did. I thought he and the Rambam assumed everyone's going to see it our way because it's so clear that this is what the text means.
Can I make at least a modest attempt to defend one piece of the Rambam on this?
Sure.
And that is that even with the language, you know that sometimes Dayanim and politicians, communal leaders, will say things with certain rhetoric. Will say things with certain rhetoric because they're trying to achieve the goal of conformity because the other possibilities make things worse. It's hard for me to conceive. It may be true, but at least another way, not to read him literally, that this was going to be sort of, the book to end all books, so to speak. That in an attempt to try to centralize and normalize, that at least it would have a significant impact. Whether he actually thought there would be no disagreement about what his words are, it's hard to believe considering in other places he seems to set the standard in which a legitimate disagreement is a legitimate disagreement, and we're going to argue it out by whatever the methods of reasoning and appealing to the Gemara and so forth. So I have trouble thinking that he really believed that the way he had done this would be an end to any further disagreement. But I think on balance it was that if I can also persuade people to move in that direction, at least I can preserve a lot of unity rather than something that is chaotic.
Yes.
So that it's a slightly nuanced reading of him.
I don't mean to imply at all by saying, by referring to delusion, that there was, delusional grandeur and it was a personal thing. As I said, I probably use the term differently than Rich Wolpo does. But, the Rif was acting L'Shem Shamayim, the Rambam was acting L'Shem Shamayim, and the need for a unified psak halakha was extremely important in that period of time for the historical reasons that I've described, and it was a great contribution to the future of the Jewish people, right? But different historical periods have different historical needs, and what I want to shift to now is moving toward the future. We've established that some of the assumptions that Rif and Rambam made were erroneous. So, did everyone get this?
No.
No.
pass it around,
No.
please? Someone might have. There were only 10 copies, so if some people could share to get, so everyone has something they can look up on. I set out some assumptions that, the subtitle of this is Toward a New Hermeneutic of Halakha, right? We need to look at what assumptions can we make and move from there toward building up something different. Okay, so the first assumption is that we should see oral and written Torah as one organic whole together, received by Moshe Rabbeinu, passed down through the generations, as noted in the beginning of Pirkei Avot. Assumption number 2 is straight out of Rambam's introduction to Perush HaMishnah. The Beit Din Gadol of each generation interpreted and applied Torah as they received it and passed down their Torah, including their Chidushim, and there's no, right, Ein Beit HaMidrash Bli Chidush, right, every generation has its Chidushim, all right, they pass it to the next generation, right, Divrei Torah Parim V'Ravim is from the Tosefta there, source 9, I believe it was, that the words of Torah, through use constantly multiply, and that we get a range of multiple legitimate opinions that are possible when we interpret and apply Torah in most situations, and it's when it's necessary to prevent divrei rivot bishareka that the Beit Din Hagadol would decide on one of the possible options by majority vote. In the absence of a Beit Din Gadol, we have local authority or regional authority in some cases, but for us it's mainly local authority, and local is very different now than what it used to be. It's every shul, I'm sure, in the 5 towns has a different local authority, and there's no 5 towns minhag, or even one Woodmere minhag. So I'm looking at Bruce.
No, that depends on the issue, though. If you have a VOD, you have a
Okay, right. Okay, so yeah, on some things where there's cooperation, it becomes more local or regional. The OU has its policies for kashrut, which apply nationwide, at least for people who look to the OU, and Agudas HaRabbanim has their different, take, or kafke, whatever. Okay, but basically, and local is very different when you can send a shaila by email to someone anywhere in the world and get an answer back in a few seconds, compared to what had to happen in earlier periods where it was a long trek with a letter before it got back to you. So, assumption number 3, written Torah has been transmitted in a fixed manner defined by the Beit Din Gadol of Ezra. It's the Torah scrolls that we have. We know in the Gemara that before Ezra there were changes made, different script, 20 textual emendations that were specifically made from what came before. Beyond that, we don't know what was before. There was, at every generation, we would assume there was something that they recognize, each recognized as Torah Shebichtav. But for us, Torah Shebichtav is what was defined by the Beit Din Gadol of Ezra, and beyond that has remained consistent. Oral tradition, though, has been memorized, has been transmitted in various ways. The first stage, if you're looking at the back of the first packet on what would be page 8 there, was, people used to transmit it by simply teaching each student in their own in whatever language came to them, right? I'm trying to get together a conceptual whole, right? Oral Torah is how do I understand, the written Torah in the context? There's a whole context for the written Torah. How do I get that across? Well, with each individual student or a group of students, a Rabbi might choose to use different terminology. That really only changed, right, as time went on, and certain teachings came to be memorized, and gradually you got to a point where after the destruction of the temple, they took eduyot at Yavne in terms of what the oral teachings had been transmitted, and Rabbi Akiva started collecting them and organizing them by subject, and then Rebbe made a curriculum out of that, which we call Matnitin, Mishnatenu, our Mishnah, that organized all of the oral law around a certain select set of cases that illustrate one legal principle per case or group of cases. Whenever you see 2 cases in a Mishnah, what's the first question in the Gemara? Tarte lamali. Why do I need 2 cases here, right? Well, srika. There's a reason why I gave 2, because you've got to understand the principle's got limitations, so you can only do that with teaching 2 cases. But the minimum number of cases is brought in the Mishnah. Okay. Now, the oral traditions that were memorized and transmitted, this is number 4, should be seen as the tip of the iceberg. Right? And the iceberg is the full context of oral Torah. And oral Torah is described as Harukam Eretz Midah. So anyway, all of Torah is described by Eov, right? It's Chokhmah there, but the Chachamim understand Chokhmah in Torah. Harukam Eretz Midah. It's greater than the earth. In Eruvin, Daf Kaf Aleph Amud Aleph, right? That means that they make a calculation based on a number of psukim that the earth is 1/3200th the size of Torah. Right, Torah is that much larger than the earth.
132 what?
1/3200. The Torah is 3,200 times larger than the earth. Okay, so there's a lot of Torah out there. There's another midrash. How could Moshe Rabbeinu have learned all of it? So he had to learn it klalim, because he couldn't possibly comprehend all of it when Hashem revealed it to him. Okay, so Torah is much great, right? So we're just getting the tip of the iceberg with the memorized traditions, Right, 5, keeping in mind the Babylonian Talmud was organized as an oral recitation of the discussions of these memorized oral traditions of Chazal, and that process continued from Ravina and Rav Ashi through the Savorim, meaning the process of organizing it went on, and the transmission in that way continued through the Geonim into the 11th century. Okay. 6 is just a little, Right, the oral traditions that are preserved in the Gemara, right, are not a comprehensive canon of the oral tradition, right? Rather, there are other oral traditions that the Geonim had, which were not necessarily put into the Gemara or the Tosefta or the Sifra or the Sifrei or the Mechilta, and some of them are referred to by the Geonim as Ke'ein Talmud, but they were all considered authoritative. And so when we see a tradition of the Geonim that we don't have in the Gemara, those who follow the assumptions of Rif and Rambam tend to say, it's outside the canon, it's not written in the Gemara, it must be wrong. So the 2 examples of that, Reshut HaRabim came up on the list a month or 2 ago. Reshut HaRabim, right, there's a tradition that it doesn't appear in the Gemara explicitly anywhere that for Reshut HaRabim you need 600,000 people. Okay, the Geonim have 4 different Geonic sources that refer to it, but it's not in the Gemara. So Rif and Rambam and those poskim who follow them, which are a distinct minority of poskim, by the way, on this, just basically say, it's not in the Gemara, we don't follow it. Reshut HaRabim applies no matter what the population of it is, as long as you've got a public square or a thoroughfare 16 amot wide that goes straight through the Mefulash from one end of the city to the other, you've got a Reshut HaRabim. Even if 100 people are living there, that's still a Reshut HaRabim. Okay. My point in that, which was in that email discussion, was that we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss the Geonim on that and assume that, no, that can't be part of the oral tradition. Right? If the Geonim had it, it seems more likely that they really did consider it part of the oral tradition. And one of the things that we need to consider in terms of what got memorized is, since memorization space is like space on a hard drive of a computer that doesn't have multi-gigabytes, right, as they do now. But when, in the days when you had to be careful how much you saved because you might run out of room, you've got the question of the Gemara constantly, Pshita, right? The Chachamim didn't memorize things that they figured you could derive from other places. I remember a friend of mine introducing me to a student at UCLA who was a physics whiz, who I was talking to him. I was taking physics at Caltech. He was at UCLA, an Israeli guy. and I was telling on exams that for Caltech that let's take a 3x5 card of all the formulas we might need. So whatever you can fit on a 3x5 card. He says he doesn't study for his exams, right? He can just derive everything from F equals ma, right? Because he understood the basic concepts of physics. He had a really good feel for it, and if you know F equals ma, the rest of Newtonian physics all follows from that. You're doing, whatever, work, you're asking about work or whatever. It's, he can derive it from that. He doesn't have to memorize it because he understands, right? So if the Chachamim, right, applied that, had that kind of knowledge of oral Torah, and they're just trying to give you, what you think you got to memorize and everything that you could derive from that based on, on this. There's a lot of stuff that they didn't think needed to be memorized that they might have been assuming that you'll get because you just know it. Right, so the assumption that if it isn't in one of our authoritative texts that made it onto the Bar Ilan database, that it's not oral Torah is probably a false one.
Is that kind of like the idea of Das Torah? Like you know so much, it's kind of like party.
Ask at it when I finish this, or over lunch, or something like that.
Yes, because
the Das Torah people can latch on to this, but there are aspects of Das Torah which go well beyond what I'm, the assumptions that I'm trying to make here.
Don't be a troublemaker.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. All halakhic authority is local and regional. That assumption by the Rambam is correct as long as we amend that it's not after the Gemara was written, but rather after the Beit Din Gadol ceased issuing authoritative rulings. There's about a 6th century difference now between those two things. Right? So that means the authority of the Geonim was local also. Okay, so no, we're not obligated to follow something because the Geonim gave a psah, and you should not derive from this, right? One of the things that someone might derive from what I'm saying about the Rambam and the Rif having incorrect assumptions is, and that the Geonim really knew things better, is, okay, so we should just go back and chuck anything that we've started doing for the last 1,000 years that goes against what the Geonim said, right? We should go by the Geonim. Well, the Geonim, there were 2 different yeshivot. We don't know, just because we've got, a tshuva from one yeshiva doesn't mean the other one necessarily agreed with it. And, it's fragmentary. I think it would be foolish for us to try, just on 2 levels. One is that, to turn the Geonim into the authority is impossible because of how little we have remaining of their work. But also that, local authority has continued in an organic way, and the local authority that any one of us have as rebbeim in our local, we don't want to create more arguments than there are. Where people agree on things and do it and don't argue about it and just accept this is the psach that we're accepting, that should be left alone. Right? Otherwise, we're doing the opposite of what the Torah says we should do with the Beit Din Gadol. Right? We're creating divrei rivot if we're trying to override what is accepted practice in a particular locality. Okay.
Except that taking care of divrei rivot is particularly in a context when something is key, palevim chadavar, get an answer and avoid tension. Right. That doesn't necessarily mean that when there is a nice, quiet behavior that is incorrect, that it should not be upset.
Right. Okay. Just be careful about how you understand incorrect, though. Right. Obviously, if the custom in a community is to do something which is clearly chilul Shabbat, right, in shul befarhesia, right, then that's something that the Rav should come in and say, whatever your custom is, you're violating a severe prohibition here, and that should change, right? Right. When it comes to the Geonim themselves, when it comes to minhag, they were very clear that you don't want to create strife in a community. If your minhagim are different than the minhagim of our yeshiva, stay with your minhagim, unless there's a davar yisur that involved, or something that might be considered genai. It's something that's just really despicable. It's ugly. Ugly was the term they used. right?
So only those.
Yeah. So yeah, those are the ones that would get overridden. But something that's within, where yesh lahem al mili smoke. There's some posek somewhere who said it somewhere, and you should really do an investigation, because sometimes we assume that that the way that we learned it is the right way. But if you look at the literature of the poskim, and a good place to start is either the tour with Beit Yosef or the Aruch HaShulchan, right? Who give at least some variations. Yeah. Okay, there are different practices out there based on different poskim, and one should respect. If a community is following one particular posek and everyone's getting along with that, and it's not creating problems, then there's no reason to upset the apple cart. If it's creating problems, that's a different issue. Right? If there are problems and you need to address the problems, then you've got a lot of tools at your disposal. Assumption number 8, right? We should assume that, with the exception of the 2 takanot that the Geonic made.
So you who did your dissertation on the Rif, therefore would severely criticize the Rif for his ruling on the tzitzit.
I'm not judging for the needs of the hour. There's such a thing as tzorach hasha'ah. And after the fact, one could make the argument that what he did was really litzorach hasha'ah, and that in the end it saved more arguments than it created. But the initial stage was creating an argument. You have to do a calculation.
But the principles you like, I want to be clear, because I'm having a little trouble with this.
Right.
Because it seems that there are other things that are being contradicted in the general lesson here.
Right.
The Rif, the way you described it, there was a minhag hamakom.
Right.
He, based not on trying to solve so much, but rather his reading of the Talmudic sources, therefore imposed with controversy on his community a way to make and therefore wear tzitzit, right?
Yeah.
And my message from you just now is quite the opposite.
Okay. We don't live in the times of the Rif. The Rif was in a situation where there was no central halakhic authority, and he was trying to establish a central halakhic authority. And the result of establishing a central halakhic authority is that you're going to solve more disputes than you're going to create.
But in this particular case, he could have left the minhag hamakom alone.
In that context, right, he creates one controversy to prevent 1,000 more. Okay, it's like Obama said regarding drone strikes. You're going to kill a few innocent people in these drone strikes, but you're going to prevent the deaths of many, many more innocent people in terrorist attacks from doing it. Okay?
Bring him up.
Huh? Okay. But basically, right? Basically, whether it's him or whomever, that was Bush's policy too.
Okay.
In some ways, you have to do some things. Okay.
Len, I know you want to go. Just one.
But basically, sometimes you got to get your hands dirty in order to get something done.
His authority on all sorts of issues where it wasn't eviscerating the minhag hamakom. And what you're saying here, as your practical advice as guidelines, is if that situation comes up, then better not to rely on a psak of the Gemara or the ruling, because we should preserve the minhag of the makom and keep the shalom bayit. That's your message.
No.
Okay, my message is because the message
Don't
is
second guess the Rif.
do a calculation of divrei rivot bisharecha. How much, if you override a current practice in your community that is one legitimate practice in there, just not the one that you prefer, right? Are you going to end up solving more issues that are not going to become bones of contention because you've done that? When Rif came in, he was basically saying, look, we don't have the Geonim to turn to anymore as live people. You've got all these tshuvot here. Everyone's going to follow different authorities. This is not the way it's supposed to be. The Gemara is the authority. We can all follow the Gemara and agree on it, and there will be peace. In order to do that, I've got to uproot things that don't correspond to the understanding of the Gemara, which is the correct understanding, which he believed to be the correct understanding.
So if I come to my community,
but the question is,
stock from the Gemara and uproot that, as the Rif did, according to your way of presentation, did I do the right thing or the wrong thing?
the reason that I would say you did the wrong thing in that situation is because we know that there is no such thing as the correct way to read the Gemara. We've had 500 years after the Rif that made it clear that there are, even if you take the assumptions of the Rif, you end up with different conclusions possibly coming from the Gemara. No, I'm not dodging it. I'm telling you it's wrong because the assumption that the Rif was going in with, which he thought was correct, has turned out to be an incorrect assumption, and that in most situations, that any situation I can think of these days, that overriding a local minhag is likely to cause a lot of strife, and I don't see where you get a sense of anything that's going to prevent strife anywhere else. If I came in, right, now, is it worth saying, oh, if we go by the Rif's reading now, we just go back to the Rif, we can solve all problems? Just let's follow the Rif and the Rambam down the line? Okay, maybe if you're from Taiman and you follow the Rambam down the line, and that's, that can work. But these days, that's not gonna solve anything. It's, no. Okay. So, right, you can read through the rest of these. Just the 12th assumption here. The Rif had no organic connection with the traditions of the Geonic yeshiva. This is, the assumption when I went to graduate school, which was in the 1980s, when I was taking my coursework, was that there was such a thing as the Geonic, North African, Andalusian tradition. And there was basically, it was all one halakhic culture. Okay? The Rif was not part of the Geonic culture, clearly. Okay, the Rif had a whole different set of assumptions. He certainly had more access to Geonic materials and a Geonic view of the Gemara than people in other locations like Ashkenaz had. So it's closer to the Gaonim. But in terms of the basic assumptions, it's as different from the Gaonim as the assumptions of Rashi and the Bavli Tosafot are different from the assumptions of the Rif. Okay? So we should not start with the assumption that the Rif has some sort of a tradition that goes back to through the Gaonim to the Bavli. Ze'eno. So where to build from this? Right, when the Gaonim do have a psak, we shouldn't be calling it incorrect. The other example that came up on the list a few years ago is tefillin on Chol HaMoed. There's a machloket over tefillin in general, whether they should be worn on Yom Tov and Shabbat, a machloket Tanaim. And then there's an opinion of, in a Mishnah in Moed Katan, that you can write tefillin on Chol HaMoed because it's Tzarech HaMoed, right? Which seems to indicate people were putting on tefillin on Chol HaMoed. The question is, though, are those people who are putting on tefillin on Chol HaMoed, would they have put on tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov also? So it comes down to, is Chol HaMoed more like Chol, or is it more like Shabbat and Yom Tov? Okay, we have two Geonic sources which say that we don't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Okay, they're tshuvot that are written outside. Now, if you think about how that would come down, wearing tefillin is something people do very publicly in the synagogue, right? If the Gaonim are saying we don't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, right, that's a public thing. It probably goes back a long time. These are practices that don't get changed over time. If it's a constant thing that's being done publicly. So at least for going back to the yeshivot of Bavel, at least by the end of the Amoraim, I would. The best assumption, to my mind, would be that the Amorim of Bavel were not wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and that the Geonic tradition regarding not wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed is probably the way. They're continuing that practice, and the whole thing about Kabbalah, which gets mixed into it later, was what got mixed into it later. When you started having disputes with some of the Ashkenazi poskim saying, but if you can write tefillin on Chol HaMoed, that means they must have put on tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and not necessarily seeing it as part of the same machloket with Shabbat and Yom Tov. Okay, so I don't put on tefillin and chol hamoed. I didn't do that from before, just because that's the way it was done in Israel when I went there as a student. But right. But if anyone had been doing it and then changed their minhag because they thought the right way is to put it on chol hamoed, I think that the evidence from the Geonim should be determinative if someone's still got a question
True,
about it.
but what if you're still on the fence as I've been for many years, and I've decided, and this is clearly intuitive, I'm blinking instead of thinking. I put bifarhesia. I don't put on film. That's actually the makom of a number of the shuls that I put. But chadrei chadarim, it's something that maybe I should be ashamed of. During Chol Hamoed, I do put on film.
Okay.
I'm saying,
I mean, look,
because
look,
there's an opinion of a PR and
Yeah.
what there should be more moed,
Yeah.
klapei tzibur in terms of what we're promoting. But look, I'm going to work, I'm writing, I'm going to surfing the internet, doing whatever, going shopping, groceries. I mean, Chol Hamoed is what it is.
Okay.
How can I not put on film?
Yesh l'kol mili smoke, and if you're convinced by that read of the Gemara, and that's what you feel most comfortable with, you're certainly not right. I'm certainly not saying that it's got to be overridden. I don't think that. It's that I would argue against those who would argue that, right? Because there are those who would argue that that's really, based on that mission in Moed Katan, that's really the only legitimate way is to put on tefillin on Chol Hamoed, because it does. That would be, I think that's incorrect, and most likely. Chol Hamoed is in the same category as Shabbos and Yom Tov, that tefillin were not put on those days for the same reason, because the Moed's an out. Right?
So.
Okay. Just to sum up, I would say Ha'elef Laka Rabbi Yitzhaq ben Yaakov ibn Alfasi. This has been your Elef, your millennium. I can't think of any halakhic authority in the past 1,000 years who has had more influence on the shape of psak halakha than the Rif, based on his assumptions, and it has fulfilled an important role in keeping halakha and halakhic practice together in the way it has been over the past 1,000 years, and we owe the Rif a debt of thanks for that. Okay. However, it's clear from the things that we're discovering about the assumptions that the Rif made and the evidence that it wasn't quite the way he assumed, that the Elef is coming to an end, and that we need to move forward with a more accurate sense, with a set of assumptions that is more defensible in light of the evidence of what really was going on in the Geonic period, and that can lead us to a path toward psak halakha, which minimizes divrei rivot bisharecha, and that leads to wider acceptance of halakha in whatever way that happens. And with all of the new technologies coming out, we have no idea how that's going to come out, but it's the people who start with assumptions that are reasonably accurate and working with those that are going to be the ones who set the groundwork for the next LF or the next 500 years or whatever the length of the period is, that will have the most influence and could influence where things go in the future in that way. So whatever contribution we as a group can make to that future, I think it starts with re-examining the assumptions, and this is a starter piece. I welcome any discussion on trying to draw them out, correct them, broaden them. It's something I think that we can make a great contribution for the future if we start working, rebuilding from an accurate set of assumptions and an accurate reading of where the community is right now and what the community needs in order to minimize divrei rivot to the greatest extent possible.